speaking with Chilton Pearce, author of many books, Magical Child Matures, Evolutions, and Crack in the Cosmic Age. Joe has been around for many years talking about neurophysiology of the heart and the heart-brain interaction. Good morning, Joe.
Good morning, Daria.
We are actually here at Joe's home in Virginia. And Joe, would you just start us off by giving us a little information? Joe has spent a great deal of time and energy investigating the research on the neurophysiology of the brain and how it operates and works in respect to learning. Can you just give us a little bit of information about that?
Well, I'm starting off with the fact that we have in our heads not one but three rather distinctly different brains. That's the research of Dr. Paul McLean, 40-some years head of the Department of Brain Research at the National Institutes of Health. And when we start off with the fact that we have three different structures in our brain, each one of which operates on its own frequency, we might say, we're on to a different ballgame and looking at children and their development right from the beginning. The next biggest item, besides the threefold or triune structure of the brain that I have found, is the connection with the heart and the new medical field of what is called neurocardiology, which translates as the brain in the heart. And this is some of the most revolutionary and extraordinary and unusual information that's come about in the latter part of the 20th century. The fact that the heart is a major source of intelligence, is probably the overall monitor and governor of the whole body-brain system. One of our major problems we're facing with ourselves in the last 50 years has been a serious disruption of the heart-brain connection itself. This is a neurological problem we've set up for ourselves, and are facing the consequences of it every day. And one of the things I've been hollering about for the last 30 years is bringing those two back into sync with each other, the brain and the heart. And now we have a massive amount of scientific information to back up what for a long time we were approaching purely from an intuitive standpoint.
Now, what are you referring to in terms of the research? Who is doing the research? Where are they? And what kinds of research are they doing?
Are you speaking of neurocardiology?
Yes.
The brain in the heart, as it's called. Well, that's from research centers all over the world. Heart research in itself has begun to branch out into the whole area of the neurological aspects of the heart. Dr. Louis Moore from Gloucester University a couple of years ago brought together the latest research from laboratories all over the world and universities all over the world, and was published as the text Neurocardiology by Oxford University. I think 1997 was the exact publication date. The Institute of Heart Math in Boulder Creek, California, a brain research center where some of the top neuroscientists in the world now come in and out of, meet there. They have been doing research on the heart and the brain connection for the past 30 years. And in about the past 10 years, that research has really just exploded fully, far beyond our wildest expectations 30 years ago.
Now, what does this mean in real-world terms?
Well,
what do you mean by the heart-brain connection? What does that mean?
The first thing it means is that which we've always attributed to just sentiment and poetic sentiment or mythology and so forth, the business of the heart, now proves to be dramatically true. One of the things that neurocardiology and the Institute of Heart Math have done is to lift information about the heart out of myth and poetry and sentiment into hardcore research, which is, of course, totally backed up by laboratories all over the world.
Well, to the parents who are listening today, how can How can we connect that brain-heart? How can we make that? What kinds of things can we do to connect that brain-heart connection in our schools and in our homes?
Well, that's a big issue because we're really, as a whole culture, literally suffering a serious physiological breakdown in coherence of the body itself to bring the brain and the heart back into the same coherent frequency, and you're dealing with electromagnetic frequencies when you come right down to it, it's really very simple, but it's not easy. The Institute of Heart Math, for instance, has programs for parents to use with their children. And what you're actually talking about is repairing the broken bond that should have been established at birth.
And how did that bond get broken?
Well, we've broken the bonding at birth systematically almost throughout the century, particularly since World War II, by our technological hospital childbirth delivery practices, which bring about a serious disruption in neural development itself and the heart-brain connection.
How does removing the mother from the child at birth sever that relationship?
Well, that took me several chapters to cover in a book I just did recently, but it's very real. In fact, we find that the major part of bonding, as it's always been called, or attachment behavior, has to do with the heart, and the fact that the mother's heart and the infant's heart go into coherent sync. That is, they go onto exactly the same wave frequency when they're brought together, and then when you separate them, the infant's heart particularly goes into an incoherent mode. We find that everywhere we have exported our medical technological childbirth practices, heart trouble follows. It really does, just like cancer of the breast follows. That's what the Israeli medical group found, that the minute you break up that bonding structure at birth, you don't get breastfeeding, you don't get that close, intimate relationship between the mother and the infant, and a whole raft of physiological as well as neurological errors take place.
Both for the mother and the child.
Both for the mother and the child.
So the Israeli group then found that, or is making the correlation of breast cancer with not having mothers breastfeeding at birth. Is that correct?
Oh, that's been around now for several years. We don't hear about it in this country because it's not part of our cultural practice. But they showed very clearly several years ago that in every case where you eliminate breastfeeding, as a culture, as we did 50, 60 years ago, in every case you have then an immediate one-for-one corresponding increase of breast cancer. Their claim was that even as short a period of time as 2 weeks of breastfeeding will reduce a woman's chance for cancer by 50%. But that's only one of the many, many factors involved in the brain-heart connection.
I'd like to remind you that you are listening to Children Come First, and with Dr. Daria Brzezinski. We are interviewing today Joseph Chilton Pearce, author of several books on child development, brain-mind research, neurophysiology of the heart and the mind, and we are looking at learning and how it takes place and some of the problems in our culture today. Joe, you just talked about bonding with the mother. What kinds of ramifications does our culture, especially, we take children away from their mother at birth in the hospital, and are what I might consider, what most people might consider, violent ways that we birth our children. Does that have an influence on, let's say, children in the future with regard to violence and with regard to learning? What happens to the child?
I would summarize this most in the shortest possible way, because you could write books on any of these topics we're bringing up. But when you break up that bonding structure at birth by separation of mother and infant, as we did for about 50 years, totally, we eliminated 97% of all breastfeeding for decades, for generations. And when you do that, there are precise neurological procedures that fail to take place in the child's development and in the mother's development, because a whole new developmental process opens up in the what's so-called cingulate gyrus area of the limbic structure of the brain, or the emotional brain, in a mother when bonding with the infant takes place. And if that fails to take place, then there are certain very specific, you might say, instinctual behaviors and intelligences in the mother that fail to manifest. And you're going to, as a result, have children who are neglected on many levels that would not otherwise be neglected. Now, the result of that neglect means that these children's earliest development of their early sensory motor system is deprived of certain very critical feedback processes that it has to have from the permanent caretaker, from the mother. Not getting these infants literally remain in kind of their archaic mode of thinking and action, and don't develop on fully into the higher structures of the brain. And as a result, you get violence, you get a lot of very anti-cultural activity, you have a lot of alienation, separation, anxiety, and fear and anger, and so forth and so on. All these can be directly traced back to the breakdown of this very earliest period. Maria Montessori, one of our greatest child developmentalists, and a lot of people don't know that she was the first woman graduated from an Italian medical school in history, and was a great pediatrician. But she summed it up to say that human abandoned in its earliest formative period becomes its own greatest threat to its own survival later on. And humankind, a mankind abandoned in its earliest formative period becomes the greatest threat to its own survival later on, as we're seeing on every hand today in the mountain tides of violence throughout the world. Everywhere we have exported our medical technological childbirth and separation processes, the same cycle of abandonment, alienation, breakdown of family structure, breakdown of social structure, breakdown of school structures, as has happened in this country, has happened in every country who's adapted our procedures.
So what you're saying then is, I've listened in the last few weeks since Littleton that we're blaming our schools, we're blaming the movies and the videos, we're blaming the drugs we give children, but you're saying then that then all of this stems much farther back. And I'm thinking here we are in a culture where we separate the mothers not only at birth but continue to separate them in our daycares. And what are we doing to children in regard with the daycare experience?
Well, by 1989, 70% of the entire American childhood under age 4 was in daycare from about 2 weeks of age on. And the majority of those children in daycare for approximately 12 hours a day, dropped off early in the morning and picked up later in the afternoon. Now, we've been doing that for a long time. The situation is much more critical today. Our government even takes away welfare support for a mother and tells her to get out and get a job and put her child on welfare, and then give her tax breaks put their child in daycare and give them tax breaks for the expense. Now, all of that is, of course, simply increasing the overwhelming instance of alienation and separation of children from permanent caretakers. One of the great problems of daycare is what we call the model imperative. They have to have a stable, steady model around which they can structure their own world. And they get many different models throughout the day, and you have the confusion of which pattern they will follow. And so these children grow very, very confused, and they remain essentially locked into these early, what's called traditionally in brain research, the hindbrain. They divided it for simplicity into the hindbrain and the forebrain. The hindbrain is the fast, reflexive, survival brain we inherited from very ancient times on. The forebrain is the later evolutionary brain, which is reflective, can contemplate, be objective about its decisions, and so forth. And you get that kind of development only later in childhood, once the hindbrain is thoroughly developed. That is, the sensory motor system is developed and fully secure and has its safe space. Then we start developing the higher, reflective, contemplative, intellectual, creative parts of the brain. And now that is not happening for the vast majority of our children. And I say the majority of our children. The breakdown of our educational system, our school system, hasn't been because of a bad school system. We've never had a good one. But we've managed to muddle through for generations simply because we had at least some sort of a stable background in our early sensory motor period. And so you find that the inability to be educated later on, we blame our children for their lack of response to our schooling as rather a moral, ethical failure of their own. And we don't realize that we're asking them to use their high, reflective, contemplative structures of brain that have never really been developed yet because they're still back there in that archaic sensory motor mode trying to get some foundation under them. They're looking for the safe space that they should have been given right from the very beginning, and it's never found. And in looking for that safe space, as they begin to develop some aspects of the higher intellect, they can get very dangerous because, a child who has never felt safe, who feels the world out there is an overwhelming threat to them, and this happens to an awful lot of our children, then their coping strategies get very, very clever, very, very intelligent coping strategies to deal with the world they can't trust. And as they go on in their development and the higher stages of the brain do open for their development, whether they're ready for it or not, or can utilize it or not, they'll use at least as much of the high brain as they need for their coping strategies, looking for a safe space. And they can get dangerous. They'll get violent. This covers so many other areas. We get into the one simple statement from the Swedish pediatrics group, one of the smartest bunch of medical people I know of. They said the child with imagination is never violent. Now that's a big, broad, blank statement, but I can vouch for it. The child with imagination is never violent. Now the child with imagination unfolds in about the first 7 years primarily, and the next 4 years critical to the development of that inner image capacity up to about age 11. And if they're given the safe space and appropriate nurturing, bonding, care, love, and respect, they develop this capacity for internal image making. It's the great creative aspect of the human being. And developing that, this child will not be driven to violence. You can't drive them to violence for a whole raft of reasons. They have developed their higher neurological structures that can modulate, moderate, and literally change and bring into balance those ancient, archaic survival structures of the earliest sensory motor period. Now, if the child isn't given that initial foundation, they stay there for the rest of their life, trying to get a foundation under them. And then when you get all these coping strategies that get more and more violent as they grow older.
You are listening to Children Come First, and we are interviewing today Joseph Chilton Pearce, author of Magical Child Matures, Evolution's End, and a number of other books. He's lectured around the world, in many, many countries, and obviously has a great deal of expertise and background and research on the connection between the brain and the heart and many of the things that we need to look at. We've talked about violence in the last few weeks because of the incident in Colorado and how we need to look at that, and Joe is giving us a perception of the things that we might need to be looking at rather than just looking at our educational, even the videos that we are watching. Joe, what you said now that I heard you, and we'll be taking a break in about 5 minutes, but I wanted to know, you talked about the first 6 or 7 years of a child's life being extremely important. For the parents out there who are listening, and we are in a traditional system of people trying to get rich fast and cramming bits and pieces of information for their children and on the internet and computers and television. And what kinds of information can you give parents who are listening out there with young children in terms of helping them develop in this critical time before age 7?
I would put the whole issue into quality of life versus standard of living. Let me back up from that for a minute and talk about Bruce Lipton, cellular biologist, who's a bit of a maverick, left the university system because his ideas had grown beyond it. But he points out that a cell or a human, an organism, when it's born into the world, can do only one of two things. It can grow and expand and encompass its universe, its world, or it can retreat and defend itself against a world it can't trust. That is, it can either grow or it can defend, but it can't do both. Our children, when they're born into the world, either, as Maria Montessori spoke of it, they open up to embrace the universe within their own neural system. They embrace the universe they have out there for them, or against that universe that they can't trust. What's the difference? In our country, we work for standard of living, and at the expense of quality of life for a child. We're after quality of life for an adult, which means how many things can we possess. But quality of life to a child means one and only one thing, and that is to be unconditionally loved, wanted, and protected by one significant person. They then have the safe space in which all development will take place. And it'll take place almost regardless of anything we do. Given the same safe space, you can't keep the child's brain mind from doing what nature spent 4 billion years preparing it to do, and that is learn. Denied the safe space, which can only be given through unconditional love, acceptance, and protection and nurturing. Denied that, the child must develop coping strategies to try to defend themselves against a world they can't trust. So you can have 3 cars in the garage, 2 television sets in every room, load them with every kind of toy on the earth, but denied the safe space of feeling unconditionally loved and wanted by one significant person. Development will not unfold, and they'll defend themselves against a world they can't trust.
We're going to take a short break here. To Chilton Pearce, our interview with Chilton Pearce, who has written many books on the subject of child development and the neurophysiological brain-mind. We'll be back after a short break. We are here with Children Come First. We are interviewing Joseph Chilton, author of Magical Child Matures, Evolution's End. He's a world traveler, has authored many books and articles, as well as given lectures around the country, both to lay as well as the medical professionals and educational professionals. We are speaking with him about child development and the neurophysiological ramifications of the brain-mind research with the heart and the brain. Joe, we were talking about the bonding issues and how important it is for the early years for us to work with our children, especially prior to the age of 6 or 7. Talk a little bit about Jim Prescott's work, Dr. Jim Prescott from the...
Well, Jim was head of the entire division of child development and care and so on at the National Institutes of Health for 14 years. And he had a very large staff of quite brilliant scientists working under him. Back in the 1970s, when crime and violence first became an issue in this country and began to be a political football, his department received a very large grant from the government to do the first in-depth scientific research into the root causes of crime and violence ever attempted. Jim and his staff spent several years on this project, bringing together all of the research throughout the world on infants, our relationship to the mammalian brain, and our close cousins, the gibbons, and so forth, and finally ended with a study of 50 different cultures currently extant on Earth, 50 different societies, as to whether or not they are benevolent and kind to each other or harsh and warlike and murderous to each other, and so on. Putting all of that information together, they then came out with two major papers, scientific studies, showing that the root causes of crime and violence could be found, first of all, in birth practices and the earliest of the formative stage of the child. Precisely those same 3 critical years that Burton White had found at Harvard University. The second stage of their papers dealt with adolescence, which they considered a second birth, because in a very short period of time, our little children suddenly grow about a foot and have this great mature body on their hands and are clumsy all over again like a toddler, because the growth is so fast they haven't even gained full control over this new muscular system yet. And so these are the two critical points of life: birth into the world from our mother and birth into the emerging adult world into another body, so to speak. Now, they put the entire research into these two big forms and asked for hierarchical approval by the National Institutes of Health for its publication. This was in 1980. The result was that Jim and his entire staff were fired, and their research was suppressed, and to this day has never really been published in full. Now, this is simply something to bear in mind, that we're dealing with issues which, in order to redress or do anything about, run counter to the entire fabric of our culture and what we are doing. Ours is a violent culture, and violence produces violence by its very nature. Let me mention, not only Burton White's research at Harvard, published in the early 70s on the first 3 years of life, saying that the first 3 years were the most critical of all, but the Swedish pediatrics group, again in Sweden, had found the same thing and presented their research to the Swedish government. Now, the Swedish government operates a little differently than ours. Immediately what that government did was to allot any mother on delivery of her infant with a full year's pay if they're working, and a full year's leave of absence from their work with full pay. And if they're not working, to allow them, give them an allotment to live on with no financial worries for the first critical year of that child's life, that they might stay right home with it. Now, this program saved Sweden so much money within one generation.
This tape is continued on side 2.
As of today, the government of Sweden offers the mother 3 years stipend, living stipend, if she will stay home with that infant for the first 3 years, because they have discovered that those first 3 years are wherein all the great downfall takes place if the child is not nurtured. Now, why do they do this? Because it saves the government so much money. Now, in America, on the other hand, we have the highest prison population on earth, except for Russia, where they have an even harsher form of child treatment than we have, and an even greater level of abandonment of their children. Now, our prison population, which is almost 2 million of our brothers, we are now stuffing into prisons. In Virginia, they've actually curtailed all school development on behalf of building more and more prisons. Now, in our country, it costs an average of $20,000 to $25,000 a year to keep a prisoner in prison, and anywhere from $50,000 to $100,000 in hidden costs of the whole political, judicial, police system to put them there in the first place. And we're perfectly willing to pay that. The largest single sum going out in this country is for the penal system, although it's spread out over such a wide area, from city, local, county, state, and then federal levels, that we don't notice it like we do something like the defense budget. Now, it costs us a huge sum of money to do what we're doing, and yet our government just recently withdrew even welfare help for our young mothers who have no support from any source. Even welfare was taken away. They're dumped on the streets with their little new babies, and they have to survive as best they can. What do we say? We're tough people. Get out and get a job and put your child in daycare. And they do, and later on those children are in a state of rage. Jim Prescott recently brought up research that has been done that shows that any child brought to the attention of the authorities by age 11 will cost his government $475,000 by the time he is 21 years of age. I'll repeat that. Any of our children brought to the attention of the authorities for their behavior by age 11 will cost us taxpayers $475,000 by the time they're age 21. And we would rather pay that than put out 1 penny for that dirty word called welfare, or caring for the well-being of our children in the earliest years of life. And I think myself we get just what we deserve in Littleton, and it happens in many, many other schools all the time, just on a less dramatic level. Every 5 minutes in the United States, someone is hit with a bullet from a gun. Every 5 minutes in the United States, someone is stuffed in prison. This, right as of today, no, we get into politically incorrect issues at that point when we talk about our minority groups. But just very clearly, 23% of one of our major minority groups, 23% of the entire adult male population is in prison at any one time. Now, this is the greatest criminal indictment against a culture that you can possibly find. So, again, we're simply talking about what does a child need in the first critical years of life. They need a safe space. And the safe space is not daycare, but simply the feeling that they are unconditionally loved, wanted, and accepted and cared for by one significant person.
So what you're saying then is that all of the money that we are funding into daycare, what you're asking is then for us to change our lifestyles literally and have mothers who stay home rather than are working.
The issue wouldn't be mothers staying home as mothers staying with their infants. I've been in many, many foreign countries where mothers get out there and slug it out with the men on all sorts of different levels, but they have their infants right with them. They carry those little ones in the early in-arms period. They carry them right with them at all times, and the children are always in the safe space. So the issue would not be...
Are you asking mothers to bring their children to work?
Whether they bring their children to work any longer is not too much of an issue to me. I'm, as my brother Don says, after your warranty has worn out as long past as mine have, and you realize you're getting off at the next bus stop, you begin to look at all of this, and you begin to just shrug your shoulder. What we do about it is up to us. Now, if we want a lot more of the same violence going on, we can continue to do what we're doing. Or we can start and do like Sweden, and now Denmark, and now Holland, and now Austria, other nations that are beginning to follow the advice of the Swedish Pediatrics Group and beginning to really nurture their children and are finding what? A dramatic change in their whole society. Or we can continue our tough-minded policies of throw them out on the street and let them survive.
So what you're saying is that the information that Jim Prescott's group had in the 1970s, we could, had we jumped on that opportunity, we may not be having the problems we're having today.
You would not have anywhere near as many problems as you have today, and I don't care what Jerome Kagan says at Harvard. I think he's profoundly wrong on a number of different levels. All of this research has been coming in for years. The fact that the quality of life given a child determines to an indeterminable extent the quality of the actual neurological structure and the brain and the child's behavior that takes place.
You were telling me a little bit earlier before we went on the air about children. You have noticed physiological differences of certain children being born today. Tell us a little bit about that.
I spotted this, first of all, about 15 years ago, and this was in a spiritual ashram in India. I saw a little American child, who was a little toddler, who had the strangest shaped skull I had ever seen. It had extremely large prefrontal lobes. That's the latest evolutionary structure added to the human brain.
Prefrontal is the forehead.
That's right behind the ridge of the brow and the front part of the forehead. And since then, these children have been cropping up more and more. They're very rare still, but I do spot them everywhere. In Thailand last year, at a big conference we had, an educational conference there, I spotted one. Several, in fact. They're cropping up in any race, any color, any creed. And then again, several of them in Russia, people following the birth practices of Tchaikovsky. Again, this very huge prefrontal lobe and this latest evolutionary addition to the brain. In this country, I've spotted, I guess, 3 or 4 dozen of them and beginning to collect the pictures of them here. Now, this is a very significant evolutionary development, but in every case it has to do with the prenatal state of the mother before the child is born. Last May, the journal Science, which is one of our more prestigious scientific journals, had a research article on the fact that a mother who's in a harsh, competitive, combative society where there is no safe space, you might say, and who feels under anxiety from that, tends to give birth to a child with an enlarged hind brain and a reduced-sized forebrain. Again, the hind brain is the ancient, archaic, sensory-motor survival part of our brain structure.
The instinct.
The instinct to survive. Fast, reflexive actions. The forebrain being the contemplative, creative, what Paul MacLean calls the angelic lobe, because the higher human virtues are there. And so if a mother is subjected to a lot of hostility in the environment, she will give birth to an infant with an enlarged hindbrain, the fast, reflexive, non-thinking survival brain, and a larger body. And on the other hand, if she feels safe and secure within herself or has a safe, secure environment. She gives birth to an infant with an enlarged forebrain and a reduced-sized hindbrain.
Ooh, that's for all the short people.
And a smaller body, not shrimp, but a smaller body than the other. That is, now, this is very significant. What it means is that when nature has the chance, when she sees that the environment will support an expansion of intelligence and creativity, brotherly love, and so on and so forth, then what does she do? She provides a larger forebrain. On the other hand, if nature is picking up the signals that the environment looks to be harsh and dangerous, she says, well, we can't go for intelligence now, we must go for defense. And we must defend ourselves, in effect. So you find that she has to develop the larger hindbrain, the fast reflexive hindbrain, and a larger body, and reduce the size of the great intellectual creative forebrain. Now this is the human spiritual dilemma right now, because the higher realms of the human spirit, our relationship to God, our relationship to each other, our ability to love and nurture and so on, resides in the so-called forebrain. And when we find this being reduced in size and a larger body and bigger hindbrain, fast reflexive actions, and no capacity to contemplate your actions before you enact them, you see. When we find that, then we find that a harsh, competitive, combative society produces an infant prepared for that. And so those infants, as they grow up, create that kind of harsh, competitive, combative society. So to him who has, it's given more and more. Our violence grows and grows. And
is there a profile of these children? I mean, in terms of the way they are raised or birthed or whatever, is there a certain thing that runs through all of them?
If you're talking about the children with the enlarged prefrontal lobes, there certainly is in every case, and I know there are no exceptions to this. The mothers of those children happen to have very strong spiritual grounding. They're women who have come into possession of their own lives. They're women who have deep resources, who have connections with their heart, who have connections with the great core of the human spirit. And they nurture those infants from conception on. The infant is, the entire uterine experience is the safe space for those infants. They're not getting those hormones of fear and anger and apprehension that the average mother is sending unbeknownst to her infant in the womb. And the infant feels loved and nurtured from conception on. And when they're born into the world, of course, these mothers I have found no exceptions to it, that they don't have natural childbirth, and they breastfeed and they nurture and care for these infants. And the infants are dramatically different. They are tremendously different. They're far more intelligent. Their development is faster. Their development is quicker on all levels. I've had pediatricians say that you can spot them immediately because of their eyes. Their eyes right from the beginning are knowledgeable, wise, communicative. They're in touch with their world. They're open and embracing their universe out there. The world is a safe space to them. It's like the superintendent of the school in California, he told me, we're getting in a tiny handful of kindergartners and first graders who are off the grass in intelligence. He said we have no curricula that can match them and no teachers who really can come up to the standards these children really demand. Now this shows that we're dealing with a new species that's coming in here. And where is it coming? To those mothers who are capable of nurturing, first of all, their own inner life. They're in the same environment the rest of us are, but they're creating their own internal environment, which is peaceful, harmonious, because they're grounded spiritually. And what does it mean to be grounded spiritually? It means to be grounded in the heart, where you have established that connection between the brain and the heart.
You are listening to Joseph Chilton Pearce. This is Children Come First, and we are talking today about child development and a variety of issues. Children physiological changes and how we can better affect and help our children to become more of who they are. I'd like to ask Joe, you talked about several, there's just so many things I want to talk to you about. And, right now the New Age, quote unquote, and the self-help books is a multi-billion-dollar industry. And most of these people are looking for all of the kinds of things and are searching for all of the kinds of things that you seem to be talking about that we have lost because of the birthing practices in the United States and many other things. You reflected on a place called HeartMath. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, there's a book that just came out by Harper San Francisco just last month. Harper San Francisco brought out the book called The Heart Math Solution. Heart Math is capital H-E-A-R-T, capital M-A-T-H. The Heart Math Solution. And I can guarantee you, if that could be read and applied, it's simple, but it is not easy. It's a challenge. But if the Heart Math Solution could be applied by enough people, we could, as a doctor in Colorado called me the other night, and he said, Joe, with that Heart Math Solution, we could turn the world around. Well, that's true. And that's the one book I would promote above all other things, including all 6 of mine. And when an author promotes someone else's book over his own, at least to that person, the book is important. One of the reasons I say that is because if a woman discovers the Heart Math Solution and has learned to apply it, which means has gotten her brain and her heart back into the full coherence that we humans are endowed with, then when she conceives and bears a child, you can believe me, we're going to have one of these new incredible humans on our hands with those great big prefrontal lobes and that tremendous capacity for compassion, understanding, and sympathy, and intelligence and creativity. And then you'll find the curbing of this whole downward spiral into more and more chaos on every hand. And I think all over the world that's the case. People all over the world pattern themselves after America, and that's unfortunate because when we start down the tube, everyone else chases us right down also. I'm thinking of my lecture tours of Japan and their great troubles internally in their social family structures and schools and all. Same thing in every country that have followed our pattern. And so the Heart Math Solution is certainly a true solution, and it has to do with the deepest core of the human spirit, and that lies within our very heart.
If you'd like more information about Joseph Chilton Pearce and any of his work, you may call Earth Heart Foundation at 570-639-2931. And after this broadcast, we can give you more information. Leave us your phone number and or your email address, and we will be happy to get back to you if you'd like to know where Joe is speaking next, or something about his book, or how to find out more information on any of the topics that he's been speaking about today. Again, we're speaking with Joseph Chilton Pearce. And Joe, in the last few moments of this conversation, can you give us some direction besides what can we do? I mean, you're telling us about things to do for the children of our future. What can we do about the generations, those children who have not been birthed in the way that we have been talking about today, as well as our teenagers today and those that are going to become adults very shortly? What can we do to help bridge this gap?
The one you can give that child, that young person, that teenager, the one thing they have never received yet, and that is love. But you can't give them something you don't already have. One bankrupt firm can't save another bankrupt firm. The biggest thing we can do for our children is to discover the heart within ourselves, to make this connection between our brain and our heart, discover that deep spiritual core within us, learn to operate from it, and then give that to the children. That is, children learn to love by being loved in the first place. And love is not just a sentiment. Love is when the brain and the heart are in their full coherent operation, and everything is different. That's what the children need. And let me say, they can be brought around so easily. They respond so rapidly to the one thing they're missing more than anything else, and that is compassion and love and acceptance. I think of Ann Marsden's work with hardcore criminals in maximum security prisons in New York, teenage criminals between 15 and 20. She said if people knew how easily they could be brought around, how easily they could be salvaged, we would as a nation simply weep. And it's true, and Ann's been doing magnificent work in salvaging hardcore criminals through what? Through just what we're talking about, bringing them back to the heart. I think of the school set up by the Rudolph Steiner College out in California, in a prison for teenagers. What was their approach? It's again a heart approach, using art and music and drama and storytelling, all the things that these teenage criminals have missed in their life. And they give them all that, and you have a tremendous transformation in a hurry. Again, the salvaging work itself is so cheap and easy, and keeping them in that prison is so darned expensive and ruinous to the whole spirit of the nation.
Well, we seem to be backwards in terms of our thinking and our philosophies about the way we should be operating. And how would you suggest where do we start? It seems that we're backwards, literally backwards in the kinds of things that we do. What kinds of things can we do? Where do we need to start?
Well, the first thing we need to do is to start and listen to very serious research that takes place, such as Jim Prescott, a man in a high position with the biggest research institute in the country, and all of his research is, as a result of it, he is fired, and his entire staff fired, and the research suppressed because it's not economically viable, we say. It goes against the cultural grain. We can continue to act this way. We can continue with television for children, as we have, and they'll continue to act the way we do. We can continue dumping computers onto the child very early in life. A lot of people make a lot of money with this, and we'll continue to get the same kind of behaviors from these children. If we just continue doing what we're doing, we'll self-destruct very shortly. On the other hand, we have to stop doing what we're doing. And you've got all of your authorities, you've got all the scientific research, it's been coming in for years, it's all there. All we have to do is open up and start to listen to it. There's no other solution. You're not going to come up with a school system that will work for damaged children. Stop the damage. It's just that simple.
We now are coming to a close with our program here, and we have about 2 minutes. What can you, in a summation, what would you like to convey to our audience?
We are in a spiritual crisis in this country and in the whole world. And the only solution to it lies within us. It's not out there on cloud nine. It's not in the government. It certainly doesn't lie in force or power. It lies within the heart. And to discover that, we simply have to turn around. We have to stop doing what we're doing and start and think from the heart. I have hundreds upon hundreds of parents who come up and they'll gesture toward their heart and they'll say, I feel I should do this. Then they gesture toward the head and they say, but I think I better do this. We have learned to distrust what our heart says and follow only what our thinking or what the people out there tell us, and as a result we're in trouble. Learn to turn within, get in touch with your own heart, and things start changing.
So we need to look at some of these self-help books and, start doing yoga and meditation. Is that what you're telling us to do, looking within?
Well, we've been meditating for thousands of years. Human nature hasn't changed one iota. However, with the heart mass solution, change takes place very fast. I don't think that there's anything wrong with meditation, but after all, it's a pretty slow process, and it's not what meets the needs of the child. It might meet some of the needs of an adult. But again, the Heart Mass Solution, the new book just published by Harper San Francisco, actually has the solution. That's why I'm frustrated even talking about it. I know it has the solution. not my book. I didn't write it. I don't make any money off it. No one does, actually. All that goes right back into research. But the Heart Math Solutions, people would just pick that up. Anybody can read it. It's written for every man on the street, every woman on the street. And follow it, and practice it, and learn to open up to their own heart. Then they're opened up to the base core of the human spirit and a higher form of intelligence. And things will start changing things.
We have been here this past hour with Joseph Chilton Pearce, author of Magical Child Matures, Evolutions, and many other books, lecturer from around the world, researcher. You may call us at 570-639-2931 if you'd like more information on Joe and all of his work. You have been listening to Children Come First, and we come to you every week from 10 to 11 a.m. every Tuesday and talk about issues regarding our children, education, family living, and many other issues. We'd like to thank you for joining us today and hope you'll be with us in the future. We will be talking with Jim Prescott, as Joe referred to, with Eugene Schwartz, who's head of Waldorf, and many other interesting individuals who can tell us about education for the next century. Thank you for joining us, and we look forward to speaking with you again in the future. Have a good day.
You can hear Children Come First again with Dr. Daria Brzezinski every Tuesday on WAAT Radio, 7:50 a.m. on your dial. Tune in again next Tuesday, 10 a.m. Have a good week.